The Red Sea is becoming a war zone between the United States and Iranian proxies, while we learn why the war in Gaza is not going to end anytime soon. We also learn more about how the invasion of Ukraine has absolutely devastated the Russian military. These stories and more in this edition of the International Affairs News Roundup. On to the first story. The Red Sea is quickly becoming a new front in the proxy war between the United States and Iran. Yemen's Houthi rebels have claimed to attack a Norwegian-flagged tanker called the Strinda in the Red Sea. They said that they targeted the ship because it was carrying oil bound for Israel. This and several other attempted attacks on different commercial ships have occurred over the past week. Both the French and the US navies have intercepted drones and missiles bound for different civilian ships operating in the Red Sea. This all comes as the US is seeking what is described as the broadest possible coalition to defend against Houthi attacks on commercial ships and to send a message that these types of attacks will not be tolerated. The current task force, known as Task Force 153, is commanded by the United States 5th Fleet and consists of 39 different countries. However, right now the US is engaging with other countries to join the task force and prevent these kinds of attacks from happening again in the future. China is a heavy user of the Red Sea and has ships in the area, and there have been discussions between the United States and China on this issue. Iran has warned the United States about the creation of this kind of a task force, saying that it would increase tensions in the region. While fighting and tensions are increasing between the United States and Iran in the Red Sea, the war in Gaza is not going to end anytime soon, and we've got two polls to tell you why. A recent survey by the Palestinian Center for Policy Survey and Research found that nearly 3/4 of Palestinians believe that the attacks on October 7th by Hamas were justified. The survey also found an increase in support for Hamas since the war began. Compared to pre-war polling, support for Hamas in Gaza has increased, while support for Hamas in the West Bank has nearly tripled. The PCPSR also highlighted the dissatisfaction with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, as only 11% of the surveyed Palestinians expressed satisfaction. Meanwhile, despite the UN's recent call for a new ceasefire and increased civilian casualties, another new poll shows that most Israelis are in favor of continuing the war until Hamas is finished. The Israeli military suffered one of its deadliest days since the war began on December 13th, suffering 10 killed, bringing the total amount of IDF killed to 115. Meanwhile, the Palestinian death toll has been absolutely spiraling, with over 18,500 Palestinians having been killed. And while there is increasing international pressure to back down, most Israelis believe that now is not the time to back down, and in fact it's time to double down and finish Hamas once and for all. We saw a ceasefire 2 weeks ago bring a pause in the fighting, and that allowed for a lot of humanitarian assistance to finally reach Palestinian civilians. However, it only lasted a few very tense days before it ultimately collapsed. And while we're unlikely to see another ceasefire, if we are to see another ceasefire, it's probably going to follow a similar pattern where it lasts a few very tense days until it collapses again. And we've already talked about why Israel and its supporters don't really view a ceasefire as favorable or very constructive, and you can check those out in our previous videos for more context. This isn't the only war that needs to be paid attention to, though. And this takes us to how Russia's military has been absolutely devastated in its invasion of Ukraine. According to a new US intelligence report that was sent to Congress, around 315,000 Russian service members have been killed or wounded since the war began in February 2022. This accounts for roughly 90% of Russia's pre-war military force. The Russian military has also lost 2,200 of its roughly 3,500 tanks and a significant amount of other equipment that it had stockpiled pre-war. These casualty figures are significantly higher than previously released figures by either side, and this indicates a significant setback in Russia's modernization efforts. In fact, the report estimates that Russian modernization efforts have been set back by as many as 15 years. And despite these losses, Russia still very much remains in the fight and dangerous. Since the war began to slow down in early 2022, Russia began to institute a quiet mobilization, mobilizing different ethnic minorities throughout Russia as well as prison convicts. And right now, Russia has as many as 420,000 troops stationed in Ukraine. However, they are drawing from old Russian stockpiles, some dating back to the 50s or even the 60s. And despite the vastly degraded condition of the Russian military, it's still very capable of defense, as we've seen from Ukraine's failed counteroffensive throughout this year. This is a staggering amount of losses in just under 2 years of fighting, and this is the heaviest kind of fighting that Europe has seen since World War II. However, Russia is receiving more bad news, and this time it's from Finland. Finland will sign a defense cooperation agreement with the United States, granting the US military broad access to areas near the Russian border. The agreement allows for swift military aid and access in the case of a conflict, and grants the United States 15 different areas and locations where we're going to have unimpeded access for training and the storage of equipment. The agreement is planned to be signed in Washington, D.C. on December 18th, and will be later ratified by the legislatures of both countries. Sweden signed a similar agreement early in December. Now this might all sound like old news because Finland recently joined NATO, so they already had these kinds of agreements in place, right? NATO acts as a framework to set a minimum standard of security assurances. However, different NATO members can seek an increased level of military cooperation should they choose to do so in bilateral agreements. For instance, the US defense relationship between Germany might be a little different from its relationship with Spain. Even though they're both NATO countries, both Spain and Germany may have sought different kinds of defense relationships with the United States over time, leading to different kinds of agreements. So while Finland does have that bare minimum of NATO protection, they're clearly seeking an increased level of cooperation with the United States through this agreement, and the same goes for Sweden. However, Finland isn't the only country that's seeking a closer military relationship with the United States. And this leads us to how there's been a development in the Venezuela-Guyana dispute. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro will meet with Guyanan President Irfan Ali in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They will meet to discuss the territorial dispute in Essequibo. And this meeting between the two will be the first since this territorial dispute recently started to flare up and will be aimed at decreasing tensions. Hey, what's up? Editor Caleb here. So as I'm editing this video, we've actually got the results of this meeting, which is great. And they have announced that they will not use force or escalate tensions over Essequibo. So we kind of have to see what exactly this means. This might be, more of like the international agreement between Maduro and Guyana, kind of saying, hey, listen, a lot of what I'm going to say is lip service, but we're not going to take Essequibo. Or it could be, him trying to posture Guyana into being, in a position where they can't use force to defend Essequibo. So we'll really just kind of have to see what this exactly means. But nevertheless, it is still a very good sign. Although Venezuela recently passed its referendum on Essequibo, the referendum is non-binding, meaning that the Venezuelan government can choose to sit on it and not act on the referendum whatsoever. The presence of Brazilian troops on the border of Venezuela and Essequibo right now also act as a pretty strong deterrent, to say nothing of the proximity of the United States. And Guyana has sought a closer relationship with the United States, seeking increased levels of training and cooperation between both the Guyanese and the US military. Maduro is also entering into an election season of his own, and he might be seeking to use this conflict as simply a way to cast off a lot of the ills that Venezuela is facing on the United States. However, there may not necessarily be an intention to launch an actual conflict. This is also with Maduro making pledges to the international community that the upcoming elections in Venezuela will be free and fair, something that will have to be seen before it can be believed. Venezuela also released a new map of Venezuela which included the region of Essequibo as Venezuelan. And while this meeting between the two presidents is a promising step, it's clear that Guyana is not going to negotiate over the status of Essequibo, and in fact has international backing that Venezuela themselves do not enjoy. So there were no comments in the last video, so if you have any comments on any of the stories we've discussed, let me know down below and we'll cover them in the next video. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on what we're talking about. There's been a lot going on, and there's definitely a lot to discuss with every thread. Like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Until next time.